Welcome to today's webinar, Find, Scan, Read, a structured approach to documentation creation. This is Sheba and I'll be your co-host for tonight. Now I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Gareth Brin, Documentation Manager at Gravity. With 5 years of SaaS expertise and a top 10 winner of the Document360 Global Writers Awards, he is a specialist in both open source and hardware docs. He is also the creator of the Find, Scan, Read content strategy. In this session, he will cover the Find, Scan, and Read model, a lightweight content strategy that is designed to help lone writers and managers build or overhaul documentation suites without feeling overwhelmed. The session breaks down how to align content with actual user behavior and ensuring information is easy to find through search, quick to scan for relevance, and effortless to read for answers. With that, I'll hand it over to Gareth. The stage is yours.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. I appreciate it. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. So yeah, I won't take up too much of your time, but as was said, what I'm here to do today is talk you through kind of a content strategy that I've been developing, what I'm calling the Find, Scan, Read model, which is kind of how I structure my approach to documentation improvement and what you can also use for documentation creation. My own experience with this is kind of through more documentation improvement. So I'll be speaking a little more on that side, but I will also kind of be sharing hints and tips about how you can also use it for documentation creation. But to give you kind of more context about how this problem came to be and what was the kind of solution that I wanted for that problem. I'll start with the obvious to say that documentation creation or improvement is scary and overwhelming, even though us as documentation specialists, if you work in the field or you've just been tasked with creating or improving documentation, an issue that we always have is the sheer volume of content needed. If you're working with a new product, what do I document in the first place? Or if you're documenting for an existing product, what do we need to know about that product? What do users need to know, how to use it? And if there's already an existing suite of documentation, how do I improve that to ensure that the users are getting optimal results and are gaining the autonomy that they need? So the problem that I wanted to set out and solve was how to remove the kind of the scariness and the overwhelm and anxiety from documentation creation and improvement. And I wanted to answer the question, how do I create a plan that works and shows results? Because as SMEs in the field of documentation, a plan may make sense to us, but it might not necessarily make sense to like C-suite leadership. So that was something that I really wanted to solve, was how do I articulate my ideas and show that I was going to make high impact quickly. So a kind of common problem that I find that we will all have encountered or will encounter is that people are very focused on the page level. So people focus on individual pages. They want better code examples. They want more guides. They want like you to fix spelling and grammar and consistency across your docs with terminology, which is all fair feedback. But what I find is that misses the big picture. So you'll be asked for more code examples, more tutorials, more guides, and just more. And what I find is that's simply not the reality. Focusing on the individual page does help users. I'm not saying that it doesn't. But what I find is that it misses out on a holistic user experience. And by user experience, I mean we are part of the product, but documentation can also be seen as this independent branch of the product that is providing user autonomy. And that goes back to our doc site as a whole. Instead of looking at individual pages, I started looking at the user experience from a doc site, from the landing page all the way to task success. What does that look like? Because there is a very harsh reality that we all have to accept, and it's that people judge our doc sites, the user experience, the branding, the ease of use. And how quickly they do that is something that always shocks me. It's about 5 seconds. We have 5 seconds to wow the user and show them that our doc site is worth exploring. And beyond that, I truly believe that I think it's about 20 to 30 seconds before a user gives up entirely. So we have to make sure that when a user lands on our doc site, that the whole user experience from start to finish, from landing on your doc site to task success, is as seamless as possible. We don't necessarily have to get them to the answer in 30 seconds, but we have to make sure that the user experience that guides them there is like a nice, easy, and good experience for them, and that they trust your doc site as well. And this doesn't even apply to just users of your product. If you think about prospects and sales, if a prospect lands on your documentation site to learn more about your product, the first point of contact with user experience and your company will be the doc site as a whole. So that also has to be used as a sales kind of pitch. Oh, the doc site was easy to use, the documentation was easy to read, and helped me get started with the community version or the open source version of the product. So I want to know more about this. And if they don't have that, then they may never contact your company to set up a call to learn more about your product. So what this model sets out to do is focus on the 90% rather than the 10%. So we focus on creating changes and updates to documentation sites and pages that hit 90% of users. If you continue to focus on individual pages and trying to please everyone, you'll end up pleasing no one and ultimately having a doc site that never truly improves. You're only helping a small subset of your documentation users rather than the 90%. So by implementing bigger changes that hit a wider user base, you'll find that the impact is greater. And you'll find that those individual kind of page updates are actually not as urgent or as serious as you would think, because it's often driven by frustration of other elements of your doc site. So yes, you should always focus on the 90% rather than the 10%. Now, the model itself is something that I originally read about. Well, not the model, the behavior is something that I originally read about in a Nielsen-Norman Group article, where through their research, they found that the user tackles documentation in 3 stages. They have to find the documentation, they scan it for relevance and confidence, and then they finally read it to gain that task success. And that is something that has always stuck with me from when I learned about this behavior at university. And it's something that I've always kept with me and I've tried to use in my own work to try and make sense of things, especially when I spent a brief period as a lone writer when I was in charge of an entire documentation suite. It was something that really kept me grounded and kept me directed. And it was something that I thought, okay, if this is helping me, it can help others. So what is the model? Find. So this is the increasing of page discoverability and findability. So making sure that users can find the words on the page. Without being able to find the page, the words on the page don't really matter because they were never going to get there anyway. And you're looking at things like IA, information architecture, and SEO. Scan. So this is increasing content relevance, consistency, and confidence. So when a user lands on a page, can they get to the information that they need quickly? Will they only scan the headings and will they understand what they need to know? By putting blocks of text in front of our users, they simply just won't read it all and information gets lost. So by implementing strategies that make the page as quick, scannable as possible, and users can get to the information that they need as quickly as possible, then we're already increasing confidence and ease of use. Because then if all they need to know is, did my task succeed, they can jump straight to a verification section and understand that. Or what do I need to make this feature work? They can go straight to the prerequisites without reading anything else and understanding what do they need to install, like Java 21, do they need an enterprise license? Anything like that that makes the journey smoother. And finally, read. This is increasing understanding and task success. So this is probably the part that we're most familiar with as technical writers and documentation specialists, is using things like plain language, code examples, testing documentation to ensure when the user finally gets through phase 1 and 2 of find and scan, that they finally get to what they need and they walk away happy. And support tickets are not raised, customer success managers aren't pinged, and everyone is happy. So that is the model at an extremely high level. And then you have kind of like, if you were to divide it into a roadmap, I always look at it in 3 stages. That the find, the scan, and the read are 3 completely separate phases, and your roadmap should reflect that. So when you present this to leadership and you think, okay, find, I'm going to redo all the information architecture on this site so it's easier to use and easier to navigate. I'm going to optimize for SEO by either doing it myself or working with an SEO specialist in-house, or maybe you want to contract someone in. And then that way your doc site appears sooner in search results. And when they land on it, they can get to the information that they need. Same with scan. Then the next stage is, okay, I'm going to make sure all the pages follow a template. I'm going to make sure that we follow a framework. And by doing that, then you create consistency and confidence in your product, because the user understands that no matter where they land on your doc site, they'll be able to find the information that they need. And finally, read. This is when you tell leadership that, okay, I'm going to break this down and I'm going to fix all the code examples, all the commands. I'm going to implement a style guide for language, spelling, grammar, and in-house terminology so that users aren't bothered by trust breakers, which are the small things on the page that just don't seem right and make them lose confidence in you, the doc site, and the company as a whole. And when you think about the impact, the way that I like to look at it is that each section of this model kind of reduces an impact, but in kind of a more meaningful way. So like find, 90% of people are always going to have to find your documentation. I don't like to say 100% because I never know if the improvement's actually going to hit 100% of users. You think scan is around 60% because not everyone's going to read or scan every single page. And then read is 10% because not everyone's going to read every single page on your doc site. As sad as that is, because we put in so much effort and we like to believe that every page has been read by everyone, it's just not the reality. So by focusing on the elements that affect all the users or most of the users, you're driving much higher impact and much larger improvements quicker. Everyone has to find your docs, everyone has to scan through them, maybe just not on every page. And then task success is driven by the read, but that's always the last stage. So it's truly the last thing that you focus on. And that's the way that I like to look at it, is that knowing that I'm hitting that 90% at the beginning. And I know that it may not seem like that, and the more influential might be fixing the code example, but I truly believe that that is just noise. And you as the expert know this and know and need to put kind of yourself forward to say, no, if I redo the information architecture, we will see greater return on investment. So now let me take you through each of these phases and let me tell you what those phases are, some tips for implementation, some success metrics, and to remember the overall goals as you go through this. Because I won't be focusing that much on tooling, but I want to provide you with a greater shift in mentality, a greater shift in strategy. Because for me, quite a lot of the overwhelm doesn't come from actually the amount of documentation that you have to write or improve. It's from the strategy and the implementation. Once you have a clear strategy and you have tools for implementation and you know this is what I'm going to do, I find the overwhelm and the anxiety disappears. So let's talk about the find phase, the one that hits probably the most amount of users. This is where you focus on SEO and information architecture. Because if users cannot find the page, the content on the page does not matter. Because what is the point? They won't be able to find it. They'll open a support ticket. They'll contact a technical account manager or a customer success manager. And now nobody is happy. The way that I like to look at this is that information architecture is a map. So you're providing the users with a map in their hands, like we did in the days before Google, and they're opening maps on their phone, and they're trying to find where they need to be. But SEO helps them find that map. So SEO is them in a shop looking at all these, like back in the day, all these kind of maps of other countries that you used to have to buy when you're going on holidays. And SEO points them to the right direction, points them to the right map that they need. So these two combined together bring users exactly where they need to be at that right moment in time. And I think when you're thinking about prospects, this is even more vital. If they are Googling a solution that they need to a problem and you can provide that, SEO needs to be there to say, hey, we have the answer over here. Look on our doc site. And then when they land on that doc site, you have to be like, great, you've made it here. Now let me show you around in a very easy way so you can get to that answer. And I think this is a common journey for everyone. So when it's even for users, like if they've lost the bookmark and they Google the solution that you are providing, then they need to be able to find their way back and they need to be able to find that page again that they bookmarked 2 years ago. And they need to go back down that rabbit hole. And you need to make sure that rabbit hole is nice and easy for them to get to. So this is something that affects everyone from prospects to users. So let's talk about some like practical tips for the find phase. I would suggest picking a framework and sticking to it. Now, when you first kind of start this journey, there will be a lot of stakeholders that want opinions on how your documentation should be structured. And like, do you want to do a feature focus, or do you want to go goal orientated, or does somebody else want a persona driven approach? What I would say is, as the SME and the person in charge of the documentation, you need to put all those ideas together and then pick the one that works best. Because as the SME for documentation, you do know best. And when I say pick a framework, like for example, Diataxis that talks about tutorials, how-to guides, explanation articles, and references, and telling people we're going to stick with that. Or maybe in your nav, you're going to put things like goal-oriented approaches. Because what I find, and that is probably one of my favorites, because what I find is a lot of people when they come to documentation, is they're there to solve a problem. So by starting verbs with like build and secure, discover, enable, install, you are guiding the user to the solution. And this is something that I find works really well. And not everyone's going to be there to solve a problem, but in reality, I think that they are. They might be there for something else, just exploratory, but I believe more people are there to solve an issue. So by providing a solution-based approach, I think that would be the best way to guide the users where they need to be. And then you start thinking, okay, the verb here is build. So talk to them through, what does building look like on your product. For example, I work for an API management company. So like one of the verbs we use is create an API. So then we might then break it up into what is an API? What is our creation wizard? That could be our explanations. And then you think a tutorial could be like how to create a TCP API that does X, Y, and Z. And then reference could be here's all these parameters, or here is a file that you can use. So you can start dividing it up really concretely to guide the user where they need to be. But what I find then is as you scale and more features are added, more and more stakeholders will say you need to address it this way or that way. And you have to make sure that whatever they are bringing to you that needs to be documented fits your model. And you have to kind of be that voice of authority to say, I understand your point of view, but this needs to fit this model because that's what our users are used to. If we start breaking up and doing goal oriented in one section and feature focused in the other, it will only drive confusion and people will just simply get lost. Another tip that I would have is, and this is more from a mental perspective, is because I find as a documentation specialist, and I'm sure many of you will as well, is that when you find a page that is littered with like spelling, grammar mistakes, broken code examples, your instinct, which is completely right, is to fix that. And I think we need to take a step back here and just say that is not the point of this phase. And I think this is where it comes back to the strategy side and not getting overwhelmed. By setting that boundary of saying, I'm not going to focus on the page content, I'm just going to put the page in the right section, that creates a boundary and a very healthy one to understand, okay, I'm not going to get overwhelmed because if I do that, I'm going to go back to the very start, which was the problem of getting stuck on individual pages. And I know that's easier said than done. It's something that I struggled with and always found a challenge. But I guarantee you, when you start implementing this approach, okay, this is a broken page, but I'm just going to move it to where it needs to be for now. Then you can keep the momentum going and keep putting in more and more improvements. And something that I always find that helps, particularly at this phase, is getting feedback from support and customer facing roles. So that could be solutions engineers, customer success managers, technical account managers. I know whenever I'm in the office and these people are there, I'm always asking questions about what's working, what's not, what feedback have you gotten recently? Do you think this is working? And I always ask for honest feedback. So we might hear like, no, it does. I'm finding that this part of your information architecture isn't working, so we need to do X, Y, and Z. Or like the SEO specialist might be like, hey guys, you're not ranking as well as you should. You need to fix A, B, and C. And this honest feedback is what is really crucial here. And I think accepting that feedback, especially at the beginning, may seem harsh and it may seem a lot. is the key to success here. And asking support like, what are the main issues driving that? What are your biggest support tickets? Is it installation? Is it discovery? Is it security? And trying to find, do we have pages on that already? And then you can start like teaming knowledge together and even creating a new information architecture from that knowledge by understanding how our customers think. We might not always get in front of customers and do user testing, but by going through people like support and other customer facing roles, you start to draw out these themes. And then you can build a very unique information architecture to your customer base that really helps them. And I think that is so crucial. So success metrics for define phase is what I like to do is baseline the amount of tickets that you get for missing information. So this is something that you need to pair with support or, like I said, customer facing roles to understand how many questions are they answering despite the answer already being on the documentation side. And that's something that I think is very crucial here. By baselining that number, you really get an understanding of how much work needs to be done here. And then if it's like, for example, we got 10 support tickets, but those answers were actually on the documentation side, or you ask them, yeah, on 3 of the calls last week, they asked, did we have information on X? And we actually did, they just couldn't find it. And then when you start implementing your information architecture and your find phase, go back to them and say, hey, what about now? And you should see a decrease and say, nope, we only got maybe 3 tickets. Because I don't believe you can ever truly eliminate a problem. Or the customer success manager said, yeah, we're not getting those questions as much anymore. And we can focus on other things. And that's really good and simple ways to really engage with this phase. And it's a really cheap way as well when you're selling it to leadership, that they don't need to invest in user testing or surveys. And I always say here, internal user testing. If you're coming up with a brand new information architecture that's going to completely overhaul the documentation side, my advice would be maybe POC at first. Provide a proof of concept. Get a few technical and non-technical members of your organization and give them goals and say, hey, on this information architecture, I want you to find these 3 pages and see, can they do it? Or even take one step back and just say, hey, can you look at this and please provide me your honest feedback? What worked? What didn't? And I think that's a really good way to do it. And like I said, it keeps it all in-house. And then you don't have to provide anything to users that's half-baked. And it's just a nice way to get the momentum going. Obviously, it's not ideal because you don't have your customer base part of that group, but it is a step in the right direction. And it's probably the most that you can do at that moment. And if that's the most that you can do, then that's absolutely perfect. So what I always remind myself is the goal for the find phase. And this is something that I encourage all of you to remember as you go through this strategy, that the goal of the phase is to simply turn the feedback from, we couldn't find information about X, to the information about X is wrong, which I know seems kind of counterproductive because you are replacing one form of negative feedback with another. But if you look at it, it's actually more actionable. And I think that's the whole point of this, is to make feedback actionable. When you start implementing these changes, feedback like the information about X is wrong is much more actionable than we just couldn't find the information. So you start isolating issues instead of just like people complaining about the doc site as a whole, they start targeting specific pages and sections. And that's much easier to fix. So something you don't have to improve or create a doc site, you just have to fix a certain section. Now the scan phase. The focus here, which is this whole is the second phase. So hopefully by now, at this point in the kind of model, you've introduced a brand new information architecture and you're optimized for SEO, and it's fantastic. The scan phase focuses on page structure and consistency. As I always like to say, if you make them read all the content, you're simply making them read too much. You need to create this consistent user experience that chunks content together in a very logical way and in a consistent way. I always like to imagine that if you have to jump from page to page, will it be the same? Whereas what I always like to say as well is, if your doc site was a book and I ripped that page out of a book, would I be able to read it? And obviously there's like for task success, there's things that like the book can't tell me, but is it the whole, does that one page tell a whole story? And if not, then it needs to be reworked. And I think this is where like frameworking and templates come in really handy, and they make the experience so much better for everyone involved. So here are my practical tips for that kind of like scan phase for building that consistency and building that overall user experience. What I always like to do is start with H1s only, so your heading ones, because we can get lost in the complexity, or at least I get lost in the complexity. Maybe it's a me issue, and you're all about to tell me that you are all geniuses and you figured this out all before. But starting with H1s is a very simple way to start chunking your information together. Even if it's like you require subsections with H2s and H3s, that's fine. But by simply chunking them together under H1s, like all of these are prerequisites, all of these are tasks, all of these are like how the API gateway works, or then you start understanding how that information fits together. And then you can start dividing it even more so to make it even easier. But if you look at like, okay, I might need 3H1s, 4H2s, and so on and so on, I find that gets very overwhelming. So by starting with H1s only and just dividing the information up very roughly into those sections, that's half the battle. And I think it finds making scanning easier in itself. And what I like to do when I'm like looking at documentation through peer review or self-review is I do what I call the heading test. So if I were to read only the headings on a page, would I understand what that page is about? Would I understand what it's going to tell me? For example, if I'm looking at a task, okay, I'm looking at the overview. So that section should tell me what is about to happen. Prerequisites will tell me what I need to do before I even begin this task. Installing the product will tell me how to install this section. Sync with X repository. Like by dividing up those sections, and verification will tell me how I know the task will succeed. So by just looking at those headings, will I know the story? Will I know the journey that I'm about to go on? If the answer is no, then the information hasn't been gathered correctly. And what I also do then as well is called what I call the chunking test. Has the information been chunked correctly? If I were to take a section on that page and read it independently, would I fully understand that section? Would I know how to complete the task, or would I understand the concept that that section itself is telling me? Because as we move forward in this new age, I believe chunking is becoming more and more prevalent. And it also helps with like the modularization of documentation. If you have to take the chunk about topic X and put it into a new page, by bring that whole section that now lives independently but is part of a wider whole on the page, it can be so much more easily transported to a new page. And then you introduce things like single sourcing and things like that that make the insertion and deletion of information much easier. So those three steps that you can all do yourself or use like AI to help you or another member of your team are really simple ways to ensure that your content is scannable and to ensure that you're chunking information correctly. I think that is very crucial going forward as well. And that's what I like to do at the scan phase to ensure that everything is working correctly. And by having set templates the whole way through from either a framework or templates that you designed yourself, I think that is the easiest way to make this phase work and to make sure users have a consistent user experience. So success metrics. Measure the time spent on a page. That is probably the easiest way. As the little infographic says, time is money. How long does it take to read the page? Are users getting lost on the page? Can you get to the information quickly? How quickly can you get there? And once again, internal testing. Hand a page to technical and non-technical users and ask them things like, tell me what are the prerequisites? How long does it take them to answer? Tell me, how do you verify that you connected to the gateway correctly? How long will it take them to tell you that information? And by getting that level of detail, then you start to understand, okay, it's working. They got there in 2 seconds. They were able to give me the information. Oh, they were looking for like 10 seconds and they couldn't tell me. Then obviously something has gone wrong. Maybe the template needs to be fixed or the chunking wasn't correct. So doing things like that, once again, a cheap in-house way of doing things is a really good way to understand how would your users approach it and would they have the same issues. Because I always find one person has an issue, many people will have an issue. And once again, it all comes back to the goals, except this time the goal is slightly different. So the goal of the scan phase is to go from the information about X is wrong to the information in the X section of Y pages. What do I mean by that? So in the last phase, the goal was to get users to tell you that certain pages were wrong. the goal for this phase is to tell you certain sections were wrong. If they tell you, oh, I needed X version of this software, not Y version, the prerequisites are wrong. Fantastic. That is so actionable and such a quick win. Let me just go in and fix that for you. And you can just do it there and then. So it's about getting more and more granular feedback that is way more actionable and less overwhelming. So like if you're using, for example, like I know a story point system of 1, 3, and 5, suddenly you have less fives because you're getting less, oh, the entire page is wrong, to like, okay, that's a 1. I can just do that quickly. Or, hey, the steps seem out of order here. I had to do it this way. And you think, okay, at least now I know it's only the task, or it's the command to verify was wrong. Okay, let me go find a new command. And I think that is a really much more actionable and easier way to handle things. So we are simply driving ourselves to be more and more actionable here. The read phase, which is, as I'm sure you'll all be happy to know, the final phase, which is the focus on content quality, clarity, task success. And this is the last phase, and probably the phase that does take the longest, especially if you have to create a large documentation set or improve a large documentation set. And what I always like to say is, if you do not have quality documentation, you have a bug, which I'm sure you've all probably heard before in many different forms, like simply as like, oh, if you don't have documentation for your feature, you have a bug. And this is all about like eliminating trust breakers, implementing a style guide, testing your documentation. So this is all about task success and building that confidence to the optimal level. So you've already built confidence that users can get to the information. They can find a relevant section within a few seconds. But now it's the last task success. Can they do what it says on the page? And then you have a full user experience if they can, and they will have faith in their product and you. So here are my practical tips for the read phase. What I would say is, because the read phase, there's a lot that you can do, like code examples, spelling, grammar, plain language, optimizing for AI agents, optimizing for translation, is theme your areas of improvement and then prioritize them. So look at it as a big picture. Like, okay, spelling and grammar, that's one theme. Optimizing for translation, that's another theme. Optimizing for AI agents, because that's the world that we live in these days. And then start prioritizing them and start looking at things like analytics to understand what areas you need to do the best. Like, for example, my analytics tell me that AI agents are becoming more and more the driver of like documentation, in the sense that providing users with our documentation. So maybe I need to focus on AI optimization, or maybe people have been complaining that like, oh, I couldn't even use it. It didn't make sense. Like the word, like the actual content itself. Okay, so let me focus on implementing a style guide, plain language, and consistency here. And then that will give you a nice way to break down this read phase into an even more granular level. And theming your problems in and prioritizing them lets you hit them one by one by one. And something that I will always say is, don't fix, build. So if you're thinking like, okay, we're having major problems with consistent terminology, spelling, grammar. Okay, let's implement a style guide and an automation that automatically checks our documentation and building it into a process. So you think, okay, you cannot send this for peer review till you have done the automated style guide checking system, whatever that may look like, and catching all those errors and areas of improvement. Or building a process like a technical documentation lifecycle, making sure like peer review and testing are built into those systems to ensure that your documentation is correct. So by building processes, automations, and AI agents, perhaps, what I find then is those areas of improvement never really come up again. They may in some other form, but what you'll find is that it's not consistent. And it might be an edge case here or there, but by building it into your process, those areas of improvement just become areas. There's no improvement needed anymore. Perhaps you make an update to your style guide and you have to retrospectively fix things, retroactively fix things. But by building processes and automations to kind of do the work for you, what I find is those areas of improvements just disappear, which I think is really nice. Here are some success metrics. What I find is baselining support tickets for incorrect documentation. I always go back to support because for me, they're our biggest heroes, always on the front line. And understanding like getting them to submit docs requests or automating a system that generates docs requests if they put a flag on their support ticket to say this should have been fixed by documentation, or it's something that was incorrect in the documentation. And by automatically generating tickets in whatever ticketing system that you use, like Jira. So then you don't even have to keep checking with support. It's just automatically fed into your funnel, and hoping then as you start fixing those issues at the read phase that they get less and less tickets about that, and their deflection rate keeps going up and up and up. Internal documentation requests are amazing. I really love them. I love getting internal feedback because documentation is also used by internal users. So people onboarding to your product internally, solutions engineers looking for a solution to a problem. So they are golden as well. So make sure you have a system set up that really captures all that internal feedback and generates tickets for you as well. And that is such a great way to ensure that you're capturing all those problems, because internal users may spot something that external users won't, or they may catch something proactively and say, hey guys, I was doing this because I know a customer will be looking for it. It didn't quite work because of X, Y, and Z. So here's how we fix it. And you can catch it before users do. And I always like to do a non-technical user test. So finding someone in your company that does not have maybe the most technical expertise in whatever product that you're using or providing to your customers, and seeing can they do it if they can. Because I work in a software API management company where it's very easily accessible. Some of you might work in like aerospace or some kind of hardware documentation where it may not be the most accessible to test the documentation in that way. But trying getting somebody else to read it at the very least is probably best. And if you do work in software like me, trying to get someone to do it is the best way. I'm not the most technical in the world. I am getting better. So I always use myself. If I can do it, anybody can do it. Or I might find somebody else and say, hey, can you just test this for me? Can you do it? And see what they say. And if they can't, and they're like your lowest common denominator, then maybe something's missing. Maybe it's not as simple as you thought. And obviously there's areas that are just so complex that a non-technical user, it's just not fair to them to be able to do it, and that's fine too. But I believe like 80% of the time, that kind of non-technical user test will succeed and will help you generate a much better kind of read for your documentation. And then the goal here, the final goal for the read phase is kind of to go from the information in X section, having kind of a TOC at the start of the page is really useful. So that users can jump straight to that section. I'm a big fan of anchors, kind of in your overview section, or just before you dive into like a task, or if they want to learn about like certain concept and it's about this whole workflow, let them jump straight to that section. Don't make them read the whole thing. Even scanning it, if there's multiple sections with multiple headings, even scanning becomes an issue. So I would, and if you can implement things like sitemaps to get users where they need to be, even better. I think it gets the user there quickly. Now, obviously, if you only have like one or two sections on the page, you don't need to.
Thank you, Gareth. And that's a wrap for today's session. A huge thanks to you for walking us through the topic today. I hope the insights shared today gave everyone a clearer understanding of how to apply the find, scan, read model as a scalable strategy for building and improving documentation. By aligning content with natural user behaviors, you now have a practical framework to move beyond the overwhelmed phase and into action, using specific techniques to make your docs more discoverable, easier to navigate, and simpler to maintain. And of course, if you have more questions or want to learn more about Document 360, then feel free to reach out to us. We'll be back soon with another session. Until then, see you next time. Thank you, Gareth, and thank you everyone for joining.